People don't laugh when they feel safe. They laugh when they think they've already won. And that's exactly what it sounded like that afternoon, sharp and careless, echoing off the polished glass walls of a downtown café where everything smelled like roasted coffee and quiet money, where shoes clicked softly on marble and no one ever raised their voice unless they were sure it wouldn't cost them anything. And in the middle of it all stood Emily Carter, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers tightening around a worn folder that had seen too many rejections, her sweater plain, her shoes a little too old for a place like this, but her eyes steady, even as the first laugh slipped out from the corner table, then another, then a low ripple that spread faster than it should have, because one man decided she didn't belong. Brandon Cole, clean suit, perfect hair, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just tilted his head and smiled like she was a mistake someone forgot to fix. "You're in the wrong place," he said, casual, almost polite, and somehow that made it worse, because the room agreed without saying a word, and Emily didn't answer. She only knelt when her papers slipped from her hands, white pages scattering across the floor like something fragile breaking apart, her breath quiet, controlled, as if she had practiced holding it in, as if this moment wasn't new, and maybe it wasn't, maybe this was just another room, another set of eyes deciding her worth before she could speak, and for a second, everything slowed. The hum of the espresso machine, the faint clink of ceramic cups, the low murmur of conversations that didn't stop. They just moved around her like she wasn't there, like she had already faded out, and then the door opened, not loud, not dramatic, just a soft shift in air pressure, the kind most people ignore. But something about it changed the weight of the room. A man stepped inside. Boots heavier than the polished floor deserved, posture straight without trying, a presence that didn't ask for attention but carried it anyway. Sergeant Daniel Hayes, though no one there knew his name yet, and beside him, close enough to feel his breath, moved a German shepherd, dark coat catching the light in quiet patterns, muscles coiled beneath calm, eyes alive in a way that didn't match the stillness of the room. And while the laughter still lingered in the air, thinner now, but not gone, the dog didn't look at Emily, not once. It didn't care about the girl on the floor, or the papers, or the whispers. Its focus locked somewhere else entirely, ears rising, body shifting just an inch forward, a subtle change, easy to miss unless you knew what it meant, and Daniel noticed. Because he always noticed, his gaze following the line of the dog's attention until it landed on Brandon, still smiling, still certain, still unaware that something in the room had already changed, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they chose silence, but because something unseen had quietly taken control of it, like the calm before a storm that doesn't need thunder to be felt. And Emily, still kneeling, lifted one piece of paper, her fingers brushing against a small metal chain around her neck, hidden beneath her sweater, just a flicker, just enough to catch the light, before the dog took one slow step forward, and the silence deepened in a way that made even the confident start to wonder what, exactly, they had missed. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like something fragile being stretched too far, and Brandon shifted in his chair, just slightly, the kind of movement most people would never notice. But the dog noticed, its head tilting just a fraction, eyes narrowing with a focus that did not belong in a place like this. And Daniel stood still, not tense, not aggressive, just present, his hand resting loosely near the leash. Not pulling, not restraining, because he did not need to. He trusted what stood beside him more than anything else in that room. And across the floor, Emily gathered the last of her papers, her movements careful, deliberate, as if the world around her had faded into something distant, something she had learned to survive without reacting to. But her fingers paused again when the low sound reached her, not loud, not threatening, just a deep vibration in the air that seemed to come from the dog's chest. And for the first time, she looked up, not at the people who laughed, not at Brandon, but at the animal that had not taken its eyes off him. And something in her expression shifted, not fear, not surprise, something closer to recognition, like a memory brushing against the present, and Brandon noticed that too, even if he could not explain why it unsettled him. He let out a small breath, forced a chuckle that did not carry the same weight as before. "It is just a dog," he said, though his voice did not land the way he expected, because no one laughed this time. Not really. The room had grown too aware, too quiet, as if everyone was waiting for something they could not name, and Daniel finally took a step forward, slow, measured, his boots barely making a sound against the marble. He does not react without a reason, he said, calm, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it, something that made Brandon's fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table, and Rex moved again, one more step, closer now, his posture still controlled, but the intensity in his gaze sharpened, not wild, not uncontrolled, just certain, like he had already made a decision, and Brandon leaned back just enough to create space, the confidence in his posture beginning to crack at the edges, his eyes flicking for a moment toward the exit, then back, then down, anywhere but directly at the dog. And that was when Daniel saw it. Not the obvious, not something dramatic, just a detail out of place, a tension in Brandon's movements, a guardedness that did not belong to someone who felt in control, and he did not raise his voice, did not accuse. He simply watched, letting the moment stretch, letting the truth surface on its own, because it always did, eventually, and Emily rose slowly to her feet, clutching her folder to her chest, the small chain at her neck catching the light again. Longer this time, enough for Daniel's eyes to flicker toward it, just for a second, long enough to recognize the shape, a dog tag, worn, real, not decoration, and something in his expression softened, just barely, before returning to stillness. And the room held its breath without realizing it, because whatever was about to happen had already begun long before any of them noticed. The air felt heavier now, not because anything had happened yet, but because something was no longer hidden, and Brandon knew it. Even if he could not explain how, his smile had faded into something tighter, something controlled, the kind of expression people wear when they're trying to hold a story together that is already falling apart. And Rex stopped moving, completely still now, his body aligned with purpose, eyes locked, unblinking, not aggressive, not frantic, just unwavering, and that was what unsettled the room the most, because there was no chaos in him, only certainty, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice quiet enough that it did not break the silence, only reshaped it. You might want to take your hands off the table, he said, not as a command, but as a suggestion that carried weight, and Brandon hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, his fingers pressing down before slowly lifting, revealing nothing obvious, nothing anyone else could immediately understand. But Daniel did not look at the table, he looked at Brandon's eyes, because that was where the truth always surfaced first, and for a brief moment, something flickered there, something sharp, something calculating, before it disappeared behind a practiced calm. I think you are overreacting, Brandon replied, his tone measured, but lacking the effortless confidence from before, and Daniel nodded slightly, as if he expected that answer, as if this was not the first time he had heard it, and, beside him, Rex let out a soft breath, not a growl this time. Something quieter, almost like a signal, and Daniel's hand moved gently along the dog's back, not to restrain him, but to acknowledge him, to confirm what had already been understood without words, and across from them. Emily stood motionless, her grip on the folder loosening just enough for her thumb to trace the edge of the worn paper. But her attention was no longer on Brandon. It had shifted, subtly, toward Daniel, toward Rex, toward something familiar in the way they moved, the way they read the room without speaking, and the small metal tag at her neck rested against her chest, still, as if it too had found its place again, and the people around them, the ones who had laughed minutes ago, now sat in a different kind of silence, not indifference, not amusement, but awareness, the kind that creeps in when certainty dissolves, when the story they thought they understood begins to change shape, and Brandon shifted again, this time pushing his chair back an inch, the sound sharper than it should have been in the quiet, and he forced another smile, thinner now. This is unnecessary, he said, but his eyes moved again, briefly, toward the door, then toward the dog, then away, always away, and Daniel took one more step forward, closing the space without urgency, without pressure, just enough to make leaving no longer feel simple. Maybe, he said calmly, but he has been right before. And Rex's ears lifted just slightly, his focus never breaking, and for the first time since the laughter began, Brandon did not respond immediately, because something deeper than pride had finally surfaced, something that could not be dismissed with a joke or a glance, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet arrival of truth that no one could ignore anymore. No one moved to stop what was unfolding, because by now, everyone understood that whatever was happening did not need interference. It needed to finish, and Brandon felt it more than anyone. The way the room had turned against him without a single accusation being spoken, the way every small movement now carried weight, his breathing just slightly uneven, his posture no longer relaxed but held together by effort. And Daniel remained calm, almost still, but there was a quiet authority in the way. He stood, not confrontational, not aggressive, just certain, and that certainty pressed against the space between them like something invisible but undeniable. And Rex shifted his weight once more, not forward, not back, just enough to adjust his stance, his eyes never leaving Brandon, reading him, measuring him, sensing what others could not. And that was when it happened. Not a sudden action, not a dramatic reveal, but something simpler, something quieter. Brandon's hand drifted instinctively toward his jacket, not fast, not obvious, just a reflex, and Rex's ears snapped forward instantly, his body tightening in response, not lunging, not reacting wildly, just acknowledging. And Daniel saw it at the exact same moment, his voice cutting through the silence, still, calm but firmer now. "Do not," he said, just one word. Enough to stop the motion midair, and Brandon froze, truly froze this time, his fingers hovering for a second before slowly pulling back. And that was all it took, that single hesitation, that single instinct, to confirm what the dog had already known, and the shift in the room became undeniable. People straightened in their seats. Conversations that had quietly resumed now died again, replaced by something heavier, something closer to realization. And Emily watched it all without speaking, her expression unchanged, but her eyes clearer now, steadier, as if the weight that had been placed on her earlier had lifted without anyone needing to apologize. And Daniel took one small step closer, his presence filling the space that Brandon could no longer control. "You see," he said quietly, not to embarrass, not to accuse, but to reveal. "He does not guess." And Rex remained still, alert, unwavering, the kind of stillness that came from discipline, from training, from trust built over years that could not be faked or misunderstood. And Brandon swallowed, his confidence now reduced to something fragile, something reactive, his voice lower when he finally spoke. "I think this has gone far enough." But it did not sound like authority anymore. It sounded like retreat, and Daniel nodded once, almost respectfully. "It has," he replied, and in that moment, something unspoken passed through the room, not victory, not defeat, but understanding, the kind that settles slowly, leaving no room for denial. And Brandon stood, adjusting his jacket carefully this time, deliberately keeping his hands visible, his movements controlled in a way they had not been before. And without another word, he stepped away from the table, away from the center of attention, toward the exit he had glanced at earlier, but now with none of the certainty he had walked in with. And as he passed, no one stopped him, no one spoke, because the truth had already done its work. And when the door closed behind him, the room exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to release what had been held. And Rex finally relaxed, just slightly, his posture easing as he turned his head away, the moment complete for him. And Daniel's gaze shifted at last, not to the door, not to the crowd, but to Emily, who stood quietly with her papers gathered, her presence no longer small, no longer overlooked. And for a brief second, their eyes met, not as strangers, but as people who understood something deeper than what had just happened, something that did not need to be explained, only recognized. The cafe did not return to normal right away, because moments like that do not simply end. They linger, they settle into the air like something unseen, and people sat a little straighter, spoke a little softer, as if unsure whether they had just witnessed something small or something that would stay with them longer than they expected. And Emily stood there, still holding her folder, but it no longer felt like something fragile in her hands. It felt steady, like it belonged to her again. And Daniel did not rush to speak. He simply gave the space time to breathe. the way he had learned in places where silence carried more meaning than noise. And Rex lowered his head slightly, no longer fixed on danger, his focus easing as his job, whatever it had been in that moment, quietly came to an end. And after a few seconds, Daniel reached down, adjusting the leash with a gentle motion, not pulling, just grounding the moment back into something ordinary. And then he looked at Emily again. Really looked this time, noticing the small details others had ignored, the way she held herself, the calm that had not broken even when the room turned against her. And finally, his eyes returned to the chain at her neck, the dog tag that rested there with quiet weight. And he spoke, his voice low, respectful. That is not something people wear without a reason. And Emily's fingers instinctively moved to the metal, brushing over it once before letting it rest again. And for the first time, she allowed herself a small breath that was not held back, not controlled, just real. It belonged to my brother, she said, her voice steady, not soft, not fragile, just honest. He was a Marine. And something in Daniel's expression shifted, not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. And he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than words, and Rex, as if understanding something beyond language, stepped slightly closer to Emily, not invading, not demanding, just present, his presence calm now, almost gentle, and Emily glanced down at him, her eyes softening just enough to reveal something she had kept hidden, not weakness, but connection. And for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded again, not because of tension this time, but because something quieter had taken its place, something steady, something human. And Daniel reached into his jacket, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, but slowly, deliberately, and he pulled out a small card, plain, simple, the kind that did not try to impress, and he held it out to her, not pushing it forward, just offering it. If you were still looking for a place, he said, someone who does not laugh first might be a better start. And Emily looked at the card, then at him, and for a second, she hesitated, not out of doubt, but because she was not used to moments that shifted this way, moments where something good followed something cruel without needing to be earned. And then she took it, her fingers steady, her grip certain, and around them, the people who had watched, who had laughed, who had stayed silent, now looked on with a different understanding, not guilt exactly, but awareness, the kind that arrives too late, but still matters. And Emily did not look at them again. She did not need to, because whatever they had thought of her no longer held weight. And as she turned slightly, preparing to leave, Rex sat down beside Daniel. Calm, composed, his work done, and Daniel watched her for a moment longer before stepping back, giving her the space to walk forward on her own. And as she moved toward the door, the light catching briefly on the dog tag at her neck, it became clear to anyone still paying attention that she had never been as small as they believed. They had just failed to see her until it was too late. The door did not slam when Emily stepped outside. It closed softly behind her, but the sound lingered in a different way, like a quiet line drawn between what had just happened and whatever came next. And the air outside felt cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint hum of traffic and the distant rhythm of a city that never paused long enough to notice small moments of change. But Emily noticed, she always had, the way the light shifted across the sidewalk, the way her breath felt a little steadier than before, and she slowed her steps just enough to look down at the card in her hand. Simple, unassuming, a name, a number, nothing more, but somehow it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something unseen, something earned without being asked for, and her thumb brushed over it once before she tucked it carefully into her folder, not as a promise, not yet, but as a possibility. And behind her, through the glass, the cafe had already begun to move again, people returning to their conversations, their routines, but not quite the same as before, because once a moment shifts the way that one did, it leaves something behind, something that does not fade easily. And inside, Daniel remained where he stood for a second longer, watching the door, not out of concern, but out of understanding, the kind that comes from knowing that not every battle is meant to be followed. Some are meant to be respected from a distance. And Rex sat beside him, calm now, his breathing even, his focus no longer fixed on any one person, but still aware, always aware. And Daniel reached down, resting his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement, not praise, not command, just connection. And then he turned slightly, preparing to leave as well, because his part in this had never been about staying. It had been about showing up at the exact moment it mattered, and nothing more. And as he moved toward the exit, a few eyes followed him, not with the same judgment as before, but with something quieter, something closer to respect, even if they could not fully explain why. And outside, Emily paused at the edge of the sidewalk, the city stretching out in front of her, familiar but somehow different. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel like she needed to shrink into it. She stood still for a moment, letting the noise pass around her, letting the weight of the past hours settle into something she could carry, not as a burden, but as a reminder. And when she finally took a step forward, it was not hesitant, not uncertain. It was steady, deliberate, like someone who had just remembered something important about herself that she had almost forgotten. And a few feet behind her, the cafe door opened again, and Daniel stepped out with Rex at his side, not calling out, not interrupting, just walking in the same direction for a few steps before naturally slowing, giving her space without making it obvious. And Rex glanced once in her direction, his ears flicking gently, not alert now, but aware, as if recognizing something that did not need to be chased or guarded, only acknowledged. And the distance between them remained, not as separation, but as respect. And as the afternoon light stretched longer across the street, it became clear in the quietest way possible that whatever had shifted inside that cafe had not ended there. It had simply moved forward, carried by those who understood it, into something that would not need laughter to prove its worth ever again. The city did not slow down for anyone, but sometimes, in the middle of its endless motion, two paths begin to align without forcing it. And Emily felt that quiet alignment as she walked, the rhythm of her steps matching something steadier inside her, something she had not trusted in a long time. And she did not turn around, not because she did not know Daniel and Rex were somewhere behind her, but because she understood the kind of presence that did not need to be checked to be real. And in that understanding, there was a kind of peace she had not expected to find on an ordinary afternoon. And Daniel kept his pace measured, never closing the distance, never falling too far behind, the space between them intentional, respectful, the kind of distance soldiers learn to hold when protection does not require proximity. And Rex moved beside him with quiet confidence, his paws steady against the concrete, his attention drifting naturally now, no longer fixed on threat, but still attuned to the world in ways most people never notice. And as they reached the corner where the street opened wider, where sunlight stretched across storefront windows and passing cars reflected brief flashes of movement, Emily slowed, not stopping, just enough to take in where she was. And she glanced at the reflection in the glass beside her, not to check how she looked, but to see how she stood. And for the first time in a long while, she did not see someone small or out of place. She saw someone steady, someone who had walked through something and remained intact. And that realization did not come with pride or relief. It came quietly, like something returning to where it had always belonged. And behind her, Daniel noticed the shift, not in her posture alone, but in the way she moved through space, the subtle difference between someone enduring and someone choosing. And he understood it without needing to name it, because he had seen it before, in others, in himself, in the moments after something inside you refuses to break. And as Emily approached the crosswalk, the light changed, the soft electronic signal marking the moment to move forward, and she stepped off the curb with calm certainty, the city flowing around her, no longer something she needed to navigate carefully, but something she could move through on her own terms. And Daniel paused at the edge of the street, allowing a few feet more distance to grow, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Because some journeys are not meant to be shared step for step, they are meant to be witnessed from just far enough away to let the other person walk freely. And Rex sat briefly at his side, watching Emily cross. His ears relaxed, his gaze steady, as if confirming something had settled the way it was supposed to. And when the light shifted again, Daniel stepped forward, following at his own pace, not catching up, not calling out, just continuing in the same direction. Because sometimes, the most meaningful connection is not in walking together, but in knowing that if the path ever crosses again, it will not be by accident. And as Emily reached the other side, the sunlight catching once more on the small metal tag at her neck, She did not look back, not because she had forgotten, but because she no longer needed to. And in that quiet decision, something lasting took root, something that did not need witnesses, did not need approval, only time to grow into what it was always meant to become. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, stretching longer across the sidewalks and turning glass windows into quiet mirrors of gold, Emily had already walked several blocks without realizing how far she had come, not because the distance was long, but because her mind had been somewhere else entirely, replaying the moment not as something painful, but as something resolved, something that no longer held power over her. And she slowed near a small park tucked between two office buildings, the kind of place people passed without noticing unless they needed a moment to breathe. And today, she did, not out of exhaustion, but out of awareness, and she stepped onto the narrow path, gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, the faint scent of grass and late afternoon air grounding her in a way the city streets never could. And she found a bench beneath a tree whose leaves shifted gently in the breeze, casting moving shadows across the ground, and she sat down, placing her folder beside her, her hands resting in her lap for a moment before instinctively reaching for the chain at her neck again, her fingers closing around the dog tag, warm now from her skin, and she exhaled slowly, not heavy, not burdened, just steady, as if releasing something she had carried longer than she realized. And across the street, Daniel paused as well. Though he did not step into the park, he remained on the sidewalk, giving her the space she had chosen, his posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing when to act and when to simply be present. And Rex stood beside him, his head turning slightly toward the park, his ears flicking once as if acknowledging her presence even at a distance, and then settling again, calm, composed, his purpose fulfilled but his awareness never fading. And Daniel glanced down at him briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them. Without words, before his gaze returned to Emily, not watching closely, not intruding, just ensuring she was no longer alone in a way that mattered. And on the bench, Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes lifting toward the sky visible through the branches above, the light filtering through in soft patterns, and for a moment, everything felt still, not empty, but complete, like a pause between chapters that did not need to be rushed. And she reached into her folder, pulling out the card Daniel had given her earlier, holding it between her fingers as she studied it again. The simplicity of it almost surprising. No promises, no guarantees, just a name and a number. And yet it felt different from all the other opportunities she had chased before, not because it was bigger, but because it had been offered without judgment, without laughter, without condition. And she turned it once between her fingers before placing it carefully back into the folder, this time not as a possibility she might consider, but as something she would. And when she stood again, brushing a few strands of hair from her face, there was no hesitation in her movement, only quiet intention. And across the street, Daniel noticed the shift immediately, the subtle change in how she carried herself, the way her steps aligned with purpose rather than uncertainty. And he gave a small nod to himself, not of approval, but of recognition, before turning slightly, ready to continue his own path. And Rex moved with him, matching his pace effortlessly. And as Emily stepped back onto the sidewalk, merging once more with the rhythm of the city, the distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like separation. It felt like two stories moving forward, each shaped by the same moment, each carrying it in a different way, and neither needing to look back to understand what had already changed. The day continued to move forward, but something within Emily had shifted into a different rhythm, one that no longer rushed to keep up with the world around her. And as she walked along the street lined with quiet storefronts and passing strangers, she noticed things she would have ignored before: the reflection of sunlight on windows, the soft hum of distant traffic, the steady cadence of her own steps. And it felt unfamiliar at first, not the world, but the way she moved through it, as if she had stepped out of a version of herself that had always been bracing for impact and into one that no longer needed to. And a few blocks ahead, she paused again, this time outside a modest building with a glass door and a small sign that carried the same name printed on the card now resting in her folder. And she stood there for a moment, not hesitating, but acknowledging the quiet weight of choice, the kind that does not come with pressure, only with possibility. and she reached for the door handle, her fingers steady, her breath even. And just before she stepped inside, she glanced briefly at her reflection in the glass, not searching for reassurance, but recognizing it. The same calm she had felt earlier now settled deeper, more certain, and then she opened the door, stepping into a space that was simpler than the café, less polished, less curated, but warmer in a way that could not be designed. The scent of paper and coffee blending into something familiar, something real. And inside, a few people moved about quietly, focused on their work, no one looking up to judge, no one pausing to measure her worth before she spoke. And that alone felt different. And across town, Daniel had already continued on his own path, his pace steady, his thoughts quiet, not replaying the moment as something extraordinary, but as something necessary, something that had unfolded the way it was meant to. And Rex walked beside him, calm and composed, occasionally glancing up as if checking in, not for instruction, but for presence. And Daniel reached down once, resting his hand briefly against the dog's neck, a silent acknowledgement of trust that had been earned long ago and proven again without effort. And as they turned onto another street, blending into the flow of the city, there was no sense of unfinished business, no need to look back, because whatever needed to happen already had. And back inside the building, Emily took a few steps forward, her gaze steady, her posture aligned with something new, something she did not need to force. And as someone behind the front desk looked up to greet her, there was no hesitation in her response, no shrinking, no doubt, just a quiet readiness that spoke louder than anything she could have said. And in that moment, it became clear that the laughter from earlier had not defined her. It had only revealed the space she was never meant to stay in. And now, standing in a place that felt aligned with who she truly was, she no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood. She carried the certainty of knowing she had moved forward anyway. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, the city continued as it always would, unaware of the small, quiet transformation that had just taken place. But for Emily, it was not small at all. It was the beginning of something she had almost forgotten she deserved, something steady, something real, something that did not need to prove itself to anyone ever again. The space inside the building did not try to impress anyone, and that was exactly what made it feel different. The lighting was softer, the furniture simple, the kind that had been used but cared for. And as Emily stood near the front desk, she realized something subtle but powerful. No one here was measuring her before speaking to her. No one was waiting to decide if she belonged. They simply saw her as someone who had walked in, and that alone shifted something deeper inside her. And the woman behind the desk offered a small, genuine smile, not forced, not polite, just real. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice calm. And Emily felt the words come easier than she expected, not rehearsed, not fragile, just honest. "I was given a card," she said, placing it gently on the counter. And the woman glanced at it, her expression changing slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, and she nodded once before picking it up. "Give me just a moment," she said, stepping away. And Emily stood there, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her breathing steady, her shoulders no longer carrying the invisible weight she had worn earlier. And for a moment, she looked around the room, noticing small details: a bulletin board with handwritten notes, a shelf with neatly stacked folders, a quiet sense of order that did not feel cold or distant. And it reminded her of something she could not immediately name, something familiar but long out of reach. And then footsteps approached from a hallway beyond, measured, unhurried, and a man stepped into view, older than Daniel, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of presence that came from years of experience rather than authority. And his eyes moved to Emily with quiet attention, not scanning, not judging, simply seeing. And he gave a slight nod. "You must be the one Daniel mentioned," he said, his voice even. And Emily felt a brief pause inside her, not uncertainty, but the recognition that something had already been set in motion before she arrived. And she nodded back. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady. And he gestured gently toward a nearby office. "Come on in, let us talk." And there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just an invitation. And Emily followed, her steps light but grounded. And as she entered the office, She noticed the window behind the desk, sunlight filtering in softly, casting long lines across the floor, and she took a seat when he offered it, placing her folder carefully in her lap, not as something she needed to defend, but as something she was ready to share. And outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside these walls and several blocks away. Daniel and Rex had paused near a corner, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement, and Daniel checked his watch briefly before slipping it back under his sleeve, not waiting, not expecting anything in return, because he never had, and Rex sat beside him, calm, his gaze drifting across the street, not searching, just observing, and after a moment, Daniel turned and continued on, his path leading him away without hesitation, and back inside the office, Emily began to speak, not rushing, not over-explaining, just telling her story as it was, and for the first time, it did not feel like she needed to prove anything, because she already knew, in the quietest and most certain way, that she belonged exactly where she was. The conversation inside the office did not rush forward. It unfolded slowly, like something meant to be understood rather than evaluated, and Emily spoke without the weight she had carried before, her words steady, her voice clear, not trying to impress, not trying to defend, just telling the truth as it was, and the man across from her listened without interruption, his attention quiet but complete, the kind of listening that does not look for flaws but for meaning. And when she finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full, as if the space itself needed a moment to settle around what had just been shared, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful, not distant, just considering, and then he nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than a long speech ever could. "You have already done the hardest part," he said, his voice calm. "You kept going when it would have been easier to stop," and Emily did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she had never thought of it that way. She had not seen her persistence as strength, only as necessity, and hearing it framed differently shifted something inside her, something quiet but lasting, and she lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her folder, grounding herself in the present, and when she looked back up, there was a steadiness in her eyes that had not been there before, not because it was new, but because it had finally been recognized, and the man leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "We can teach skills," he continued. "We can train. We can guide. But what you have, that does not get taught, and it matters more than anything on paper." And Emily felt the words settle into place, not as praise, but as something real, something she could carry forward without questioning. And outside the building, the late afternoon had begun to soften into early evening, the light warmer now, stretching across the street in longer shadows, and Daniel walked at a steady pace with Rex beside him, the rhythm of their movement familiar, unspoken, and, after a few steps, Rex glanced up at him briefly, his ears flicking in quiet awareness, and Daniel gave a small nod, almost instinctive, as if acknowledging something that had already been understood between them, and they continued forward without looking back, because they did not need to. And back inside the office, the man reached for a sheet of paper, sliding it gently across the desk, not with urgency, not with expectation, just an open offer. "If you are willing," he said, "we can start. With a trial period, nothing complicated, just a chance to see where this goes." And Emily looked at the paper, then back at him, and for a moment, she did not feel overwhelmed, she did not feel uncertain, she felt ready, and she nodded, a simple, clear motion that held more meaning than words. And as she reached for the pen, her hand did not tremble, her breath did not catch, it moved with quiet confidence, and in that small, ordinary action, something extraordinary settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. And as she signed her name, the last trace of the doubt that had followed her earlier in the day seemed to dissolve completely, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need validation from anyone else. And in the quiet stillness of that office, it became clear that what had begun as a moment of humiliation had quietly transformed into something far greater, not because of what others had done, but because of what she had chosen to become in response. The pen did not make a loud sound as it moved across the paper, but to Emily, It felt like something far greater than ink settling into lines. It felt like a quiet decision becoming real, something that could not be undone, not because it was permanent, but because it was chosen with clarity. And when she placed the pen back on the desk, there was no hesitation in her movement, no second guessing, only a calm acceptance of what came next. And the man across from her gave a small nod, not celebratory, not dramatic, just acknowledging what had already been understood. "Welcome," he said simply. And the word did not feel formal. It felt grounded, like it belonged there, and Emily allowed herself a small breath, one that carried a hint of something lighter than before, not relief exactly, but recognition. And as she stood, gathering her folder once more, the weight of it had changed, not in size, not in content, but in meaning. It was no longer a collection of things she needed to prove. It was simply part of her story, and she held it with ease. And as she stepped out of the office, the hallway seemed a little brighter, the sounds a little clearer, as if her senses had adjusted to a different frequency, one where she did not need to filter herself through doubt. And the woman at the front desk looked up again, offering another genuine smile. "Everything go all right?" she asked, and Emily nodded, her expression steady. "Yes, it did," she replied, and this time, the words carried a quiet certainty that needed no explanation, and she moved toward the door, pushing it open into the evening light that had now softened into a warm glow across the street. And as she stepped outside, the air felt different again, not because it had changed, but because she had. And she paused for just a moment on the sidewalk, letting the light settle across her face, the small metal tag at her neck catching it briefly before resting again. And somewhere further down the street, Daniel had slowed his pace without realizing it, as if something in him had sensed a shift without needing to see it. And Rex, walking beside him, lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking in that same quiet awareness. And Daniel glanced down at him for a brief second, then forward again, and he did not turn around, not because he did not care, but because he trusted the outcome, the same way he had trusted the moment earlier without needing to control it. And Emily took another step forward, merging once again into the flow of the city. But this time, she did not feel like she was being carried by it. She felt like she was moving within it by choice. And as she walked, there was no trace of the laughter that had once filled the room behind her, not because it had been erased, but because it no longer mattered. It had lost its place in her story, replaced by something quieter, something stronger, something that would not need to be defended or explained. And as the evening settled in, with lights beginning to glow in windows and the hum of the city shifting into a softer rhythm, it became clear in the most understated way that the moment had not ended when she walked out of that café. It had only begun, unfolding into something that would continue long after the echoes of that laughter had disappeared completely. Some endings do not arrive with applause or loud celebration. They arrive quietly, like the last light of day settling across a city that never stops moving. And as Emily continued down the sidewalk, the evening wrapping itself gently around her, she did not feel like she had won anything, not in the way people usually measure victory. There was no moment of triumph, no need to prove anyone wrong, only a quiet sense that something had finally aligned within her, something that had always been there but had gone unseen for far too long. And she walked with that understanding, not holding it tightly, not guarding it, just carrying it as naturally as her own breath. And the small metal tag at her neck rested against her chest, steady, familiar, a reminder not of loss, but of connection, of strength passed from one life to another in ways that words could never fully explain. And somewhere behind her, though now far enough to no longer be part of the same moment, Daniel and Rex had already disappeared into the rhythm of the city, their presence never meant to stay, only to intersect, to shift the course just enough, and then move on, the way quiet acts of grace often do, leaving no trace except the change they create. And as the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of light along the pavement, Emily passed by reflections of herself in darkened windows. And this time, she did not look away, she did not question what she saw, because for the first time, she recognized it fully, not the clothes, not the posture, but the person beneath it all, someone who had endured, someone who had remained, someone who no longer needed permission to stand where she was. And the laughter that once filled that room earlier in the day had lost its voice completely, not because it had been silenced, but because it had become irrelevant. It no longer belonged to her story, and in its place, there was something far more enduring, something that did not fade with time or distance, something built not from what others believed, but from what she had quietly proven to herself. And as she reached another intersection, the light turned green, and she stepped forward without hesitation, blending into the flow of people moving in every direction, yet no longer feeling lost among them. And in that simple act, something profound settled into place. Not a lesson spoken out loud, not a message written in bold words, but a truth understood in silence, that strength does not always announce itself, that dignity does not need to be defended, and that sometimes, the moment people choose to look down on you is the very moment your path begins to rise beyond their reach. And as the night continued to unfold, carrying her forward into whatever came next, it became clear in the most quiet and certain way that she had not been changed by what happened that day. She had simply remembered who she had been all along, and that was something no one could ever take away.